And hello, everybody. Welcome. We're going to just allow participants to come on in. This is the way we do it with Zoom. We start the webinar and we allow for you to enter the Zoom room, the virtual conference room, which we've tried to. There's donuts. There's some pastries, a little stale. Sorry about that. And the coffee.
Yeah, but I understand the traffic's been a little tough, so.
Traffic's tough. Sorry about the temperature in the room. Yes, it's cold. The seats are hard. We can't do much about that. But anyway, this is where we make really silly jokes in this awkward period of time as people are coming in. We'll start in about 10 to 15 seconds, our formal webinar. But thank you all for being here.
Absolutely.
And it looks like they're still coming in, Dave. I have a little ticker thing up there. All right. And
they're just pouring in through the doors.
That's it.
Violating all orders on social distancing.
That's it. People without masks. It's just Dave. It's mayhem in these Zoom rooms. I got wash your hands. Wash your hands. All right, here we go. All right, welcome everybody. We are going to begin this month's installment of Let's Talk with Dave Hingsburger. And this is such a very interesting and timely topic for all of us on this planet. We have been through 1 year plus of this pandemic, and we've been through ups and downs and everything in between. This article that we're going to explore is talking about three things that are near and dear to certainly our hearts, which is the 3 Ps in the pod: the pandemic, the professionals, and the people. That's the name of this really, really wonderful article written by Doctors Rader and Macbeth, who I'll introduce to you in just a second. But let's begin. A couple things about Let's Talk with Dave Hingsburger. This is a webinar series that's been going on for many years, and it's a companion webinar that is done every month to dive deeper into each issue of the International Journal of Direct Support, and I'll show you what that is in a second if you're not familiar. Most of the people probably that are on this webinar are familiar, but if you're not, we welcome you to a presentation that's a little different than typical webinars. This is more like a radio show, and now it's more like actually a talk show that you'd see late night. These days we're seeing, whether it's Conan O'Brien or all of the late night talk show hosts, they do what they do on Zoom. We're doing that now with our Let's Talk series with interviews. Dave Hingsburger sits with people that write these wonderful articles in the International Journal and dives deeper into the subject matter. We want this conversation to continue. This conversation is going to be specifically about COVID-19, the impact of the virus, vaccines, and so forth. But the conversation is really about our role in supporting people with disabilities, intellectual disabilities, most specifically, and how we deal with this terrible pandemic, and now how do we deal with getting out of it with the advent of the vaccines. So we want you to keep the conversation going, but we also want you to sit back and kind of enjoy the banter and the information and the conversation that you're about to hear from Dave and Mark and Rick. We couldn't do this project, this continued program without a partnership with VITA, Community Living Services in Canada, that's the organization that ultimately produces the International Journal for Direct Support. The National Alliance for Direct Support Professionals, that's who I represent. And then, of course, HANDS, the Family Help Network in Canada. Those three organizations together bring you the international journals, and these subsequent and concurrent webinars each month. And for that, we're privileged, honored, and proud to be in that partnership. This month, the March 2021 issue, you can get it in 3 different languages, in English, in Spanish, and in French. It's completely free. You go to vitacls.org. That's www.vitacls.org, as you also see there on the screen. And you go to that website. That's the Vita Community Living Services website, which is really, really cool. And then also, you want to go to Learning Resources, hit that, you'll get a drop box. It'll say for direct support professionals, and boom, you will then enter the treasure chest, the archive of over 10 years, over a decade of these journals. Please go and get them. But you can find this month's right there. Little tease, next month, we don't have the date yet, but the name of next month's journal, international journal, will be The Art of Apology. Ooh.
I need to apologize.
Yes, go. It's an art form, Dave.
That's not next month. That's the month after.
Oh, it is. Okay.
Next month, we're still going to be looking at the pandemic and our way out. So I realized that slipped my mind.
No worries. No worries. So everybody that's listening, you just heard Dave, tune in May for The Art of Apology. And in April, we don't know what the heck it's going to be, but it's going to be a continued discussion on the pandemic. So no worries. But regardless, please go to the website and check out vitacls.org and look at the archive as soon as you can if you have not looked at it before. And everything that's in that archive is free, downloadable, available. Please do it. Let's get right to it. I have the honor of introducing 2 colleagues and I believe 2 friends that have helped the National Alliance for Direct Support Professionals out quite a bit since this pandemic has affected all of us. And let me just cut to the chase and just introduce each of them. I'll start with Dr. Rick Rader. Rick Rader. Dr. Rader is the director of the Habilitation Center at Orange Grove Center, where for the last 24 years, he has been responsible for the creation, the implementation, and the evaluation of novel programs in healthcare delivery for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. He is the Vice President for Public Policy and Advocacy at the American Academy of Developmental Medicine and Dentistry, and serves as the Editor-in-Chief of Exceptional Parent Magazine. Dr. Rader is the Senior Global Advisor for Inclusive Health Innovation at Special Olympics International, and he's also the Medical Advisor to the National Alliance for Direct Support Professionals. Thank you for that service, Dr. Rader. Dr. Rader is a member of the steering committee at the National Task Group for Intellectual Disabilities and Dementia Practices, and is a member of the National Council of Disability here in the United States. So Dr. Rader, welcome. We're very glad you're here. Next, Mark Macbeth, PhD, Dr. Macbeth. About Mark. Professor Macbeth earned his bachelor's degree in biological sciences from the University of Vermont and his doctorate in biochemistry and molecular biology from the University of Chicago. His 20 years of experience in the field of RNA, he's going to talk all about this, RNA biochemistry, began with his doctoral thesis on how messenger RNA is translated into protein. His specific research interests include the study of molecules that can change the sequence and structure of messenger RNA, which is that's the composite of what a lot of these vaccines they're going to be talking about. That's what it's made from. He is currently an assistant professor at Butler University in Indianapolis, Indiana, where he teaches chemistry, biochemistry, and their affiliated laboratories. And this spring semester, he's teaching a course on the development of the SARS messenger RNA vaccine. He'll talk about that later. He and his research team of 6 undergraduate students are developing a testing program to detect antibodies to the SARS-CoV-2 virus in students, faculty, and university staff. So between Dr. Macbeth and Dr. Rader and this fella, Dave Hingsburger, who is our moderator, our friend, our colleague, and I'm gonna hand it over to Dave to get into a conversation with the 2 good doctors. Have at it. Oh, wait a minute. Right before we have to do, wait a minute. We have to do a poll.
Yes, we got to do the poll.
We're going to do the poll. Okay. So you folks that are joining us, you get to answer a poll question. We got 2 polls for you today, one at the beginning and one at the end of our session. So let's start with this one. And here we go, Dave. You ready to read it to our?
I am.
Here we go. Okay, go.
If you could get the vaccine today, would you? Yes, already got it. No, we're not sure.
Wow. Wow. See, I can see.
You always do that, you know.
I know.
You really always do that.
I know. I can see it, Dave. You can't.
I know.
I have power. I have control right now, and it makes me feel really big and wonderful. No, it doesn't. I wish we could. I wish everybody could see this, but I think that might ill affect the results, right? That's a statistician thing. I know a little bit about statistics. I failed it 3 times.
I can't answer.
Okay, I'm going to end the poll. Looks like everybody's voted. Ready, Dave? Here are the results, and here we go.
70% already got it. 9% said no, and 9% said not sure.
Interesting. Is that surprising to any of you?
It is surprising to me a little bit, and it tells me, I think, a little bit about the audience that chose to come today, because I know that in Canada there's still issues regarding distribution and getting the vaccine to people. So I'm really pleased to see that degree.
Okay. So Dave, to you.
Okay. So why did you write this article?
Hey, Dave, it's Rick. Let me take a shot at that. Before I respond to that, I want to circle back to the title of today's webinar, and that's the 3 Ps in the pod, where it's the pandemic, the professional, and the people. And I dare say, I would suggest that there's an actual 4th P in that pod, and that's purpose. And I think that's very, very important for us to realize what is the purpose of this webinar and what is the purpose of addressing the pandemic and the professional and the people. And the purpose is basically what is the purpose of the DSP, and those things are interrelated. So I want everybody to appreciate that. It's really the 4 Ps in the pod, because without purpose, there is no outcome, there is no endpoint, and there is no reason for us doing that. So, you know, in terms of why did I write this article, or why did I join Mark in writing this article, there's actually 3, possibly 4 reasons why articles are written. One, obviously, is to entertain. That's not the purpose of this article. The second one was to inform or to warn somebody, and that might be one of the reasons why we wrote this article. But to me, the reason that I wrote this article is probably the most important reason why any article should be written, and that's to move people to action. And in the case of DSPs, we wanted this article to move people to action. We wanted them to recognize their situation. We wanted them to recognize the unique parameters that they find themselves in. And we also wanted to give them an impetus to change their behavior, or if their behavior was working, to fortify their behavior. And there's also probably another reason why we thought this article would be important. And that was basically to show the outside world how important DSPs are to keeping the harmony in the DD world. That was why I wanted to. And besides the fact that I work with DSPs on a daily basis, I try to fortify them, I learn from them. I think it's important to give back to the DSPs. So that was part of the reasons why I particularly was interested in writing this article. And also to capture it. We know how busy DSPs are, and we know that they can't always go to webinars, et cetera, even though some of them are archived. This is something that would be perennial. And I dare say that the article, in terms of how do we respond to an impactful situation that we had no control over, is not just for pandemics. It could be for anything that's coming our way. because the mechanics and the preparedness and the readiness are going to be the same, whether or not it's something we can see or something that's microscopic.
Yes, and I think that it was interesting taking a look at that poll at the get-go, because you can see the degree to which people with the direct support professionals are taking care of themselves and taking care of the people that they serve based on the decisions that they're making. So could we hear from you also, Dr. Macbeth?
Right. So I think Dr. Rader put his finger right on the button, talking about the sense of purpose. And the reason why we wrote this is, to call people to action. As a scientist, I think about all of the misinformation that's out there regarding these vaccines. And, I'll be honest, and as I'll go into it in a few minutes, this is complicated stuff, right? I've been in the lab for a long time researching RNA and biochemistry and all of this. And it's sort of a sense of purpose for me to help explain this to non-scientists and to try and set the record straight on how these vaccines are working, what you can expect when you receive them, and how they'll protect you, and how it will save lives. And ultimately, that's the purpose for writing this article, is to call people to action, to get them to be less hesitant, to promote them getting the vaccine, to making that decision to get the vaccine, and to help the general population and beat this pandemic. Because really, that's the way we're going to beat this pandemic, is to get everybody vaccinated.
I was going to say, there's another reason, and that's basically when we educate the DSPs and basically provide them with the rationale and the science of why this is important, it becomes a ripple effect. If they're basically enthusiastic about getting it, they're going to basically share that enthusiasm with the people that they are supporting and the people that they're providing supported decision making. It's not unusual for us to hear negative vibes from those DSPs or whatever their reasons are against it. And very, very often that attitude basically is promoted through that group home or through that area of influence. So we're writing this article not to just address the problems by the DSPs, but basically to ensure that they are at least providing accurate scientific information to the people that they're entrusted to care for.
Yeah, and when I was listening to the introductions, particularly yours, Dr. Macbeth, when it was describing what your history had been and what you've done, and there were all these words that I could understand individually, but put together, I had no idea. I had no idea what it was that you did, and I still really don't. And it seems to me in your answer that what you're wanting to do is to take this information and do like a translation or make it in such a way that it's not intimidating, because it immediately becomes intimidating when people are hearing words and phrases that they simply can't understand because they don't have the education or the background or whatever. And I had no idea what it was that you did. But taking that information that you've learned in science and making it available to us seems to be the best of what we do, even as DSPs, is we want to ramp language. We want to make it accessible to people so that they can actually take in the information.
Exactly right. Yep. I was actually, and honestly, with going back to the poll, I was really heartened to see that response rate, the 70% that have received it or are willing to receive it. That's great news. And so, yeah, on the right track so far.
Yeah, we are. We are. Okay, so what impact have you seen since the beginning of the pandemic on the lives of people with disabilities and their direct support professionals? So,
Dave, I'll take a shot at that. What we saw basically was what we expected for the most part, and one of the immediate rationales of the behavior was the pandemic caused lockdown and shutdown. And so the people that had historically been enjoying and thriving in the community were denied that. And despite the fact that we did our best attempt to explain to them why, and we'll discuss this later, I assume, it's very, very difficult to explain the concept of virology to somebody who has a cognitive impairment. And as a result, we failed explaining to them. And that failure basically demonstrated to them that they felt that they were being punished without reason. They weren't allowed to go to work. They weren't allowed to go out for pizza. They weren't allowed to go home to see their families. They weren't allowed to go to Special Olympic events. And their behavior was, as expected, the same behavior that you and I would exhibit and demonstrate if we felt we were being unfairly punished. And it's not rocket science to basically see, how do you respond when your world is turned upside down? And so we saw evidence of depression, feelings of isolation, loneliness, despondency, anger, aggression. We saw an increase in self-abusive behavior. We saw changes in stamina, alertness, bowel changes, sleep cycles were disrupted. We saw weight loss, we saw weight gain. And we also saw, unfortunately, an increase in the prescription and the delivery of psychoactive drugs. So we saw all of those things and we hopefully responded to them, but with little training, little expectations and little resources, I'm afraid that we weren't always so great and Johnny on the spot. The other thing is there's another side to the what did we see that I so thought was quite interesting. And it was not something that we expected, not something we anticipated, and it was not something that we considered. And there's a segment of the IDDD population in group homes that when they were put back into their group homes and were not permitted to go back into the community, we actually saw a small segment of them thriving. And that really confused us. We saw that their behavior basically was no longer atypical. We saw a decrease in some of their psychoactive drugs. We saw elation. We saw basically engagement. And we basically saw a lot of happiness. And we were confused because we were compared and we expected, all the manifestations of everybody who was no longer allowed to be in the community to be what I described earlier with the depression, the isolation, the self-abusive behavior, and the anger, etc. And I think that when we looked at it, and I talked about this with behavioral analysts, we found out that, the community options were not the best for everybody. Certainly the community, in my opinion, is the best place. It's the best place because it's the best place for opportunities to explore new relationships, new places, new activities, etc. But when you come down to it, unless that is your choice, your real choice, and not necessarily the momentum of the movement, then that may not be the best place for you. And we saw that this was giving those individuals a reprieve in not going to places that they didn't want to go to, not being with people that they didn't want to be with, and basically not doing the things that they were almost encouraged to do. And I compare that to a group of 10 firemen that are recently retired. And, if you follow the trajectory of these 10 retired firemen, you'll find out that 5 of them always want to go back to the firehouse to have lunch with the guys and basically polish the fire truck. 3 of them will want to go fishing, and 2 of them or 3 of them will just want to hang out in their back porch. And that basically demonstrates the choice when given that particular option. But we did see, quite the contrapositive behavior. And I think that this is going to be food for thought when this pandemic is over, to go back and reevaluate how accurately we are representing and we are basically providing the real choices that we hope that we have been giving. So I think that was something that was really, really interesting to me and basically a change about. And so it impacted on them in a lot of ways. It also gave them opportunities to do things at home that they had not been able to do because it was always get up and go. And basically, home is a good place to start from. But certainly we did see the negative consequences of denying people those areas of interest that they had enjoyed for several years now, and that was engagement in the community with new friends, new opportunities, and new places to visit. So, but it's basically a lot of the negative behavior came as a result of their interpretation that they were being punished needlessly and without reason. And that basically put the burden on us to do a better job of explaining, which is not easy.
You know, I do a lot of work with advocate groups, and shortly after the pandemic started, maybe 2 or 3 months in, I had the opportunity to do a Zoom group with people with intellectual disabilities, and we talked about the pandemic, and along with all the emotions that you outlined, the one that really struck in my mind was somebody said right at the very beginning that they feel captive. They felt captive, and they felt captive not by the pandemic. They felt captive by their staff. They didn't understand why their staff was doing what they were doing. They didn't understand what the motivations were, but they knew what it was like to be captive because they'd been in institutions before. And that really struck me that the degree of some of their anger and so forth was coming from a sense of there are people who are making decisions about me, making decisions for me, and that haven't involved me within the whole process of decision making. So, and I can really see where that would lead to a lot of the behaviors that you were talking about. Um, they also saw that staff were free to make different decisions than they were. So, sense of captivity. So,
You know,
anyway,
Dave, let me just say, I think that was very insightful of you. The idea that possibly their feelings of being captive was a reflection on earlier life experience of being institutionalized. And I dare say we might have seen some behavior that is really reflective of post-traumatic stress disorder, which
yes,
basically is the reappearance of traumatic activities that would happen long ago. We also know that traumatic activities and stress early in life, even though you are removed from that situation, there's a segment of memory that basically, given the right conditions, will always reactivate that. And so possibly some of these negative activities and behaviors that we're seeing could have resulted from post-traumatic stress disorder, from the reawakening of those captive days when they were institutionalized.
yes, absolutely. Because one of the main things that we promised people with disabilities when we started this service to them and when they came from the institution to the community was you will now be free. And then suddenly, without much explanation or explanation that really worked, my freedom has been taken from me. And you promised it, you know, so there's, I think, a dynamic regarding their past and their present and what was promised and what became real. So Dr. Macbeth, could we hear from you, please?
Yeah, so not being in the direct support professional community, my sort of question is, how are folks with disabilities sort of responding to having that freedom taken away when, you know, they can't even sort of interact with their family members, you know, people that they don't necessarily live with? And I just noticed this with my father, who is in a independent living facility. It's locked down. I can't go visit my father. And I'm just, it has to have this profound effect on them, on their mental health. And it's just incredibly sad. And yeah, I think, I don't know, it's just, it's hard to even put myself in that position.
Yeah, it is. And when we look at, we've spoken about the effect of this on people with disabilities, but the effect of this on direct support professionals as well. I was in conversation with somebody just a couple of days ago about the pandemic, and she reminded me of something that I hadn't thought of before. But she said she felt like she was in a double boiler, and my mother used a double boiler all the time. I have never used one in my life, but it's you put a pot in, you get it boiling, then you put another pot over top of it, and with other stuff in it, and whatever happens happens. And I think that is a really a good way of sort of seeing where people with direct support professionals are. You know, they're going into this situation. It's not exactly the same, but it's just as hot and just as scary as it is for um, people with disabilities when they're trying to provide this service.
So Dave, if you go back to that, Dave, if you go back to the other slide. Yeah, I just want to address the second part of that question and the impact of the direct support professionals. And I want to thank you for wording that question that way. And what impact have you seen? Because neither Mark or I are direct support professionals, so we can't say this is the impact. We have seen it, we have heard about it. You know, not being a DSP, our response to it is basically secondhand observation. But you know, there's an expression that we have in the workforce that one can't do the work of two, but two can do the work of three. Unfortunately, very, very often with the workforce shortage, we're lucky to have one. And that one person is very often asked to do the work of two and maybe even the work of three. So the fact that they have a limited workforce with limited resources, limited training in the context of how do you keep these folks happy, safe, and healthy in a confined area was really, really has impacted on them the same way the confinement has impacted on the folks they're supporting. You know, and you know, at my age, I reflect back into the 1950s where I used to, one of my favorite TV shows was I Love Lucy. And, you know, one of the favorite episodes was Lucy and her girlfriend working in a candy factory.
I remember.
You know, on basically, you know, a conveyor belt. And they had to put chocolate on these candies as they went by. And of course, you know, at a slow pace, they were able to do it. And they were content with doing it, which is probably the most important consideration of any job. As that conveyor belt sped up, they were unable to keep up with the pace. And basically they had chaos. And we saw that in the same conditions in the group homes, where typically you had a complete workforce and basically nothing was being done except something was being done out of routine and ritual. When that thing was pulled out from under them, a lot of the behaviors that we saw in the folks that they were supporting, we saw manifested in the DSPs themselves. And we saw something that's called compassion fatigue. And that's basically, despite the fact that you got great self-satisfaction and self-esteem in knowing that you're assisting somebody, the arges and the rigors of that particular task can come back to haunt you. And when you lose that self-esteem and you lose that satisfaction, then that compassion becomes a fatigue. Let me also spend a couple of minutes to explore something that I think is very, very often overlooked. And everybody talks about, you know, oh, he's burnt out. You know, I'm okay with the concept of being burnt out, because historically what happens when you burn out is basically you decide that this profession, this occupation, this environment is not for me, and you move on. And very often that is very helpful, because not everybody who is a DSP should have been a DSP to begin with. So sometimes the burnout syndrome is the way that we wash the folks that were providing suboptimal care. So I'm okay with burnout. My concern is something that I call brownout. And brownout are the stages before burnout. And basically brownout is that syndrome, that condition in which you say, I no longer enjoy this profession. I no longer like what I'm doing. In fact, I no longer even like these people that I'm supposed to be supporting. But because of the economy, because of the expectations of me to keep this job, I'm not going to leave the job. But I'm going to make certain concessions in exchange for me staying here. And those concessions basically are the things that manifest eventually into abuse, neglect, and mistreatment. Well, okay, instead of spending 5 minutes talking to somebody about what they want to do, I'll just tell them what I want them to do. Basically, if I give somebody 15 minutes to take their medications, maybe I'll only give them 5 minutes to do that. If I normally would basically just pop my head into the shower to see if they need any help, maybe I won't do that. And maybe, yes, there'll be a risk of them falling or getting hurt, etc. So that's really a job for the supervisors to distinguish between brownout and burnout. And when somebody is exhibiting what I call brownout, that's the time to basically re-educate them or basically exchange them for somebody else. And some of the signs of compassion fatigue and basically feeling that you're mentally exhausted, are what you would expect. Well, you're angry, you're impatient, you can't get your work done, you no longer take pride in having your work done correctly, you zone out and your mind wanders, you don't sleep well, and the worst part is doing unhealthy things, maybe drinking excessively, using drugs, or you're not putting on your seatbelt, you're depressed, you worry a lot, the exercise that you do feels harder and harder, and as a result, you do less and less of it. Your eating habits change, you make more mistakes, and also you feel more pain because the psychic phenomenon of burning out and being mentally exhausted basically are physically manifested. And so you have headaches, backaches, stomach problems, sore muscles, things like that. And that's when we have to not only recognize that, but we have to create an environment in which we're not stigmatizing somebody for calling out that, hey, I need help, I need a rest, I need respite, I need more support. One of the other things that has been a result that has impacted on the lives of the DSPs during this is unfortunately a loss of confidence in the agencies that did a suboptimal job of supporting them, whether or not it was not supplying them with PPEs or not making sure that they had rest and not making sure that they had the resources to provide innovative, creative activities in a closed environment, etc. So one of the impacts that I have, quote, seen is that there's more of a turnover, and it's more difficult when word gets out to recruit the next generation of DSPs because they're hearing about what life was like in the confines of the lockdown. So this has had a major impact on the way we do business these days.
A number of agencies that I work with and am aware of have tried to deal with the brownout by allowing people to staff exactly what we took from people with disabilities, a degree of freedom to be creative, to come with ideas when they were looking at, so how are we going to fill our days? How are we going to fill our time? And now I'm seeing in most of the organizations around Southern Ontario, some really good, really creative work that people are really engaged in and really enjoying doing. And it's sort of brought back an enthusiasm for the work that they were doing. But that would never have happened if they hadn't been put into this situation. Some of the most amazing ideas. Okay, so please tell us the basics about the vaccines that are now being used. Please. And once again, um, I didn't follow your introduction. so remember who you're talking to here.
Yep. So, right. So, yeah, so I'll warn the viewers and listeners that this is a complicated subject. I could spend an entire academic year talking about this this topic, but I'm going to try and break it down into the core parts, the core take-home message, and how these vaccines work. And I'm going to talk about the four that are largely available in the United States and Europe and South America. And these are the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines and the AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson vaccines. And I'm going to start out by just sort of talking about what they all have in common and what they're going to do when you receive that vaccine. The way that the vaccine works is that it sort of tricks your immune system into thinking that you have a coronavirus infection. And so that trick is played on the immune system by delivering the instructions for a specific piece of the coronavirus, a specific part. It's called the spike protein. And the instructions that are delivered into our arm when we receive the shot, they tell our cells, let's start making this spike protein so we can generate an immune response against it. And when we generate that immune response against the spike protein, our body remembers that. So if we're ever exposed to a coronavirus, the SARS coronavirus in the future, we can generate that immune response really fast and fight off the potential infection. And so that's basically how vaccines work, right? And so what's important to know is that when we get that shot in the arm, we're not being injected with coronavirus. We're missing, there's lots of parts that are missing. All we're receiving are the instructions to make that one spike protein, which by itself is harmless, okay? And when our immune system sees that spike protein, we start making antibodies to it, and these antibodies are going to provide this immunity. But even before we start making antibodies, we have an immune response that kicks in right away. And it's the same immune response that we would see if we were actually exposed to the coronavirus itself. And so that's why we might start to feel some side effects from this. We might feel a little bit under the weather, low-grade fever, some inflammation or swelling or a sore arm, because it's our immune response sort of kicking into gear. And so when that happens, we are able to fight off any potential infection from a coronavirus in the future. But what's really interesting about this, this method of generating this immune response is how these instructions are for that spike protein are being delivered. And this is some new technology. And you heard in my introduction, all of this business about this molecule called RNA, right? And so I'm an RNA biochemist. The new vaccine technologies, especially the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, are using RNA technology. And so I was really, it gets me very excited to talk about this because this is my field and I'm really happy to share it with you. But again, it's complicated. I'm going to try and step back and explain just briefly what RNA is and what it does. And so you've probably heard of DNA. DNA is the instruction manual that makes all of us who we are. It's why I have brown hair. It's why I'm a specific height, specific sort of body weight, metabolism, tone of voice. All of this is encoded in my DNA, right? And so all of that DNA has to be transmitted to molecules called proteins, which are actually doing the work. The molecules that make my hair brown, right? The molecules that allow me to grow to a specific height are all based on proteins. And the problem is the DNA language and the protein language are different. And we need a translator molecule to translate those instructions in the DNA to those in the protein. And that molecule is an RNA, okay? And so humans have 20,000 different DNA sequences. All of those are translated into 20,000 different proteins through 20,000 different RNAs. But coronavirus is really simple. Coronavirus only has about 30 different RNAs making about 30 different proteins. And one of those is the spike protein that I talked about earlier that we're generating our immune response against. So what we're getting when we get that injection are those instructions just for that spike protein. It's an RNA molecule that's going to tell our cells how to make that spike protein so we can generate that immune response. And so we can't get a coronavirus infection because we're missing all of those other instructions that are required to make the coronavirus. Again, all we're getting is just those instructions for that spike protein. And that's the basics of the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines. It's using these RNAs. The Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca vaccines are a little bit different, but are relying on the same principle. The Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca vaccines, we're getting injected with or we're providing the instructions that are in the DNA. So it's a DNA that's being injected, and our cells are then making the RNA and eventually that spike protein. The result's the same. We make that spike protein, we generate that immune response that's going to afford us the protection. And so that's basically, in a nutshell, a year's worth of biochemistry and how these vaccines are going to work. And I hope it was clear, and I hope it sort of simplified the story a little bit.
I don't know. Yeah, I wish you were around when I took biochemistry. I might not have had to have taken it a second time. So I just want to add that both the Moderna and the Pfizer requires 2 shots to bring them up to its highest level of potency, and the other 2 are a single shot. Now, what's interesting is what has been observed in England. England had the opportunity, and they had the option of saying we could give the majority of the population 1 shot, even though 2 shots are required, and compare that to basically giving the smallest segment of the population both shots. So they have opted to give more people 1 shot than to give less people the 2 shots. And they're finding out that the efficacy, the efficiency of the single shot is very, very close to that of the second shot. And so the philosophy, which I agree with, it's better to have the majority of people with 80% or 85% protection than a small segment of the population with 90%. And that might be the wave of the future until those countries can catch up with it. But I also want to add that vaccines have an incredible safety record. The first vaccine was given in 1798 by a British physician, Edward Jenner, for smallpox. And it's a result of the smallpox vaccine resulted in the only human disease in history that has been eradicated. I'm in my 70s, and when I was growing up, everybody got smallpox vaccines, and I have a little depression in my arm to demonstrate that. And everybody probably, smallpox was eradicated in the late 70s. So people growing up after the 70s, smallpox was a non-entity. So we have an incredible safety record with vaccines. One of the concerns of people in terms of the safety margin was the quick development period. Historically, vaccines would have taken 10 years to develop and to basically satisfy the FDA regulators. So the question was, well, how could this be safe if it took less than a year compared to the typical 10 years? And 2 things about that I want to address. One was, I think that we did a lousy job of basically marketing this. We were pushing the concept of how fast this was being developed. We even called it Operation Warp Speed. Warp speed basically being a speed that's faster than even the speed of light. And so we promoted and we pushed the fact that this was happening so fast. And we didn't do as well a job of demonstrating the fact that the safety precautions and the procedures and the steps also went hand in hand with that. And I basically likened it to getting your car registered at the motor vehicle department. The whole process really takes 5 minutes. But like me and like many of you, you probably have spent up to 2 hours in line waiting to get to that cashier. Now, if they had replaced that cashier with 10 cashiers, that 2-hour wait would have been expedited. That, in essence, is what the FDA did under the guise that the population needs this. And so they removed a lot of the bureaucratic inefficiencies. They combined some of the animal and the human studies, and they basically expedited it. The FDA basically had 100 cashiers to basically, register your car, and that's really what happened. So I myself and my wife, who is also a physician, we both received both of the vaccines, and no side effects, and we are very, very happy with it.
if I could talk a little bit more about the safety here. So again, side effects are largely minor. Again, a low-grade fever, aches and pains, a feeling like you're a little bit under the weather. If you feel that, it means your immune response is working and that the vaccine is working. And so that's a good sign. You may not feel anything. If you're lucky like Dr. Rader, didn't feel anything. I myself got my first dose last week and I had a sore arm for about a day or so. But one thing that I want to talk about with respect to safety is you may have heard about the Astrazeneca vaccine not being used in some European countries. They sort of put a hold on rolling out that vaccine, which has now been revoked. They're sort of back at full speed with the AstraZeneca. It was thought that it would lead to blood clots as a side effect, but it turns out that statistically, those receiving the vaccine were no more likely to get blood clots than the general population. And so the health ministers of these countries have decided to go back to using AstraZeneca, which is a very good sign. And there's no sort of biochemical rationale to think why this vaccine would cause a blood clot. There's no sort of correlation in the biochemistry or a reason why this would occur. So, but it seems like they are, so far they're largely safe. There is a very, very small population that may have an allergy to a compound called polyethylene glycol, which is a component of some of these vaccines, and it could lead to an anaphylactic response or a severe allergic reaction. And in the Pfizer study, it turned out to be 1 in 90,000 people were affected by this, which statistically speaking is very, very small. So it seems like they're largely safe.
I think we have a responsibility to a certain extent to just trust our senses. I mean, for me, looking down at the United States and realizing the number of people you guys are vaccinating every single day, I am not hearing of a wave of zombies coming over the hills of Tennessee. So clearly there's not been a reaction to any great extent, or we would have heard about it. It wouldn't be possible to keep that silent.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, I would like to just give a word about the concept of safe and what that means. Vaccines, as good as they are, do not guarantee 100% protection. And even if you have been vaccinated, we still want to basically enforce and basically reinforce the need for us to adhere to the CDC guidelines or to those guidelines of the British Medical Association, which still reminds us, despite being vaccinated, we still need to wear masks. We still need to practice good, thorough hand washing and also social distancing and disinfecting the environment. Now, one of the reasons why this is called a novel virus is because we never had it before. And as a result, we didn't have an entire library of information. A lot of the stuff was unfolding on a daily basis. And to give you an example of how this entire concept is changing, historically, the CDC has encouraged us to maintain 6 feet of social distancing. And now they basically, after some serious studies, have found out that staying socially distant for 3 feet gives you the same protection as 6 feet. So there's basically an example of the fact that things change on a day-to-day basis. Our knowledge base is a moving target. And so it's very, very important to be ready to jettison old information that's been replaced with evidence-based new information based on science.
Yeah, and I think it's the fact that information has changed and often has changed quite quickly, that has left people questioning the information that they're getting at all, which is a real concern to me. I mean, obviously, we're learning throughout the pandemic, and we're taking in new information all the time. So we need to be responding to the new information, and as you said, jettison the old stuff.
I'm sorry to be the wet blanket on this incredible discussion, but we have 5 minutes So we have a poll question, but we also can this be answered in a minute or less?
I can try. So as Dr. Rader just said, it's a moving target. We are still learning how the vaccines work. We are still learning how the virus works. It depends on the strength of our immune response. As time passes, we will know more and more about this. But from what I know about the previous coronavirus outbreaks, and there was one in the early 2000s, a different type of coronavirus, our immune response lasted 3 to 5 years to that before that virus sort of faded away. And so my hunch is these vaccines are going to be good for about that long as well. But again, it's a moving target. Also, as Dr. Rader mentioned, that requires 2 doses. Again, that is to really boost that immune response, that initial one. And as he said, it seems to be as effective in 1 dose, or nearly as effective in 1 as 2. But again, it's a moving target. We just don't know yet. So
the other aspect is the need for vaccinations and additional vaccinations or a booster shot is going to be dependent upon the different variants that the virus throws at us.
right.
One thing we do know about viruses from our 100-year study is that they have a tendency and a propensity to change, to basically outsmart and outwit the immune system. And so basically, so far we've had several, namely the South African, the Spanish, and the UK variants. And although we thought some of them might outsmart the current vaccination formulas, at this point in time, we have every confidence to believe that the vaccines will cover those. But there's no guarantee that in the future, new variants, new mutants of that vaccine won't require us to go back to the lab.
And I can't emphasize enough, it's a foot race. We need to get more people vaccinated before the virus can mutate again. And Dr. Fauci put in a great quote several weeks ago: if the virus can't replicate, can't make copies of itself, it can't mutate. And the only way we can prevent that replication is to establish what we call herd immunity, get enough of the population immune so the virus can't grow and replicate and make copies of itself. And if it can't do that, it can't mutate to a new variant.
Yeah, this concept of herd immunity is very, very important, but it's difficult. Let me take a crack at trying to explain herd immunity. Let's say you live in a neighborhood and there's been a lot of break-ins in the neighborhood. Maybe your house has been broken into. And so the first thing you do is you put a decal on the window that this house is protected by the Ajax security company. But the local robbers realize that, gee, it's only a decal. We're going to disobey it. We're going to continue. And so that's exactly what happens with the viruses. The viruses see your first attempt to keep them out doesn't work. So you're not satisfied because your house has been broken in with the decal. So now you put lights on the outside of the house. And that might work for a little while until the robbers realize, well, the back of the house doesn't have any lights, so we're going to break in that way. And so it's a continuing, as Dr. Macbeth said, it's a foot race. And then finally, basically, you put in an alarm system and your neighbor puts in an alarm system. And finally, even though, let's say there's 100 houses in your neighborhood, only 70% of them have the lights and the alarms. The robbers basically say, this neighborhood is not friendly for us and we're going to move. And that's exactly how herd immunity works. It's you have the majority of the cells and the majority of the hosts basically being inhospitable to the virus, and the virus says, it's just not worth it for us. Let's move on to another species, or let's become dormant for several years, etc. And that's basically why we want to encourage as many people as possible to be vaccinated. That's why we want to encourage as many households as possible to put the lights on and the stickers and the alarms on, because the quicker we do that, the quicker the word gets out to the viruses and the word gets out to the burglars that there are better places for us to be.
Okay, we're just about to leave, but we have a question here that's been hanging in our question box. I have a question. What if you already had COVID? How will the vaccine affect you?
Go ahead, Dr. Rader, if you want to.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the recommendations are indeed to get vaccinated, that it could possibly works in two ways. One, protect you from further infections, and it could also alleviate some of the lingering symptoms that you could have experienced as a result, mainly breathing, cardiovascular, or neurological, or skin problems. So it could also work as a treatment for those symptoms that came from the initial infection.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to have to say goodbye, eh, John?
I think we are. Unfortunately, we don't have time to launch the poll, but hey.
Oh, let's go launch it.
Should we launch it? Let's launch it. Let's launch the poll. Stick around, folks. Come on, it's Friday. Come on. Hold on. Here we go. Go for it.
After listening to this presentation, have you changed your mind about getting the vaccine? In the chat box, please indicate what changed your mind. Yes, no, or still unsure.
Here we go.
I sincerely hope we haven't turned anybody away.
There's one that said, we don't like any of you. No, I'm joking.
Put that guy back in his lab. Don't let him out again.
In fact, Mark, I've got to say, I was on our Facebook page, and one particular person said, your explanation of the vaccines and Dr. Rader's explanation of the vaccines was just wonderful, because it just cleared the mystery. So thank you.
Yeah, it helped me as well. I thank you for that.
Here you go. Here's the results.
Okay.
So, 17% said yes, it's changed their mind. 62% said no, and 10% said still unsure.
Yeah. Well,
Because 10% seems to be above what we had before, but we
Yeah.
had different numbers in. This is 6 people versus 8 people.
There you go.
okay.
Hey.
Well.
So, Dr. Macbeth, Dr. Rader, Dave, thank you very much for this. This hour flew by. It always does when we have such interesting topics, especially topics that are so literally life and death associated. So thank you both for the work that you do, and for contributing to our community of direct support professionals. We're really indebted, and we thank you. And as always, Dave, thank you. These conversations can't happen without your facilitation, and we just really appreciate that. Please look us up, nadsp.org. All the things that we can give you, resources, we can give you membership if you're interested in that. We really want you to be part of our community and our organization. Check us out. Always to Dave and to Angie Nethercott, who are ultimately the monthly editors of the International Journal. Thank you. If you want to get in touch with Dave and find out more about this International Journal, please reach him at the email address right there. But until next time, it's going to be spring is breaking through, at least here in the Northern Hemisphere. I hope next time that we are together, that you can look outside and see some flowers. And please, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to reach out to us at the NADSP. Thank you for your time today, and we'll see you down the road. Thank you again, doctors and Dave.
Yes, thank you.
My pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you.